Hi, I'm Bev Bernstein Frank. I was born May 27th, 1934, here in Omaha, Nebraska, at Methodist Hospital, which I guess at that time was on maybe 36 and Cumming Street. Uh, my parents were Sam and Sonia Bernstein. We always called my mother Sonny, though her legal name was Sarah. But we always thought that Sonny was more becoming to her because that was her personality. Let me see. My parents came here both in 1922. Both were on, let's see, my dad was born in Poland in 1901. My mother was born in Russia, I believe it was Kiev, in 1904. But both of them left for the United States and were on the same ship but didn't realize it. At the time, they both came here November of 1922. I believe they met at a old, like a foreigners dance, the Greener, I think they called them. And it was at the Labor Lyceum. In fact, I think my dad came with another woman, but kind of spotted my mother and ditched the other woman and took my mother home. And that was the beginning of their romance. They were married December 20th, 1925, on the little shoal on 25th and was it Cummings or Izzard? And see, when they were first married, they lived somewhere near that little synagogue, and they rented a room, which I guess was acceptable in those times. You didn't rent a house or anything, you just rented a room. And I think they lived there probably till they were able to rent a house. I'm trying to think where the house was. 21st and between maybe Charles, and then they tore that house down for the housing projects. But that's where we lived when I was born, and of course there were two brothers before me. My oldest brother, Lou, was born in 1927, and my brother Dave was born in 1929. So I was the baby of the family. Trying to think. My dad was a fruit peddler, and I know he had a horse with a wagon when he first started out, and then it was big time when he got a truck, a Ford. It was a 1926 Ford. So I remember he would be cranking it up to start it going. But I think prior to being a peddler, I think he might have worked like as a blacksmith. and then he went to peddling. I think when my parents were first married, my mother worked at some place called M.A. Smith. It was a cap factory where she was a real good little sewer. So that's what she did. And like I said, I think my dad was a blacksmith at the time, then went into peddling. After they tore down our house on 21st Street, we moved to North 19th Street. We lived between Clark and Grace. In fact, it was 1825, North 19th Street. And it was predominantly a Jewish neighborhood then. We had, to the south of us lived Frida and Abe Gandler. Across the street from us was a family named Adele's. In fact, that's where my parents used to get their chickens. They'd have chickens running around in the backyard. So for Shabbos, they would go over and get the chicken there, and we'd get our eggs over there. I'm trying to think who else was in the neighborhood. Also across the street from us was a family named Jangers. I think they had like a little junk business. Then to the north of us, there was the Friedmans, Kaplans. Helen Kaplan was one of my best friends. She's now Abrahamson. Next door to them lived the Yarmolniks, who later went to Molnik. There was the Goodman family next door to the Molniks. Dan Goodman, Harold Goodman, Martin. I think they had a sister, Shirley. I was always the baby, but I know my brothers had a good time with all the boys in the neighborhood. The Gendler boys next door to us were the same ages as my brothers. So they spend a lot of time outside playing whatever they played in those days, kick the can and maybe throw a softball around, a baseball. What else? I'm trying to think, what else did we do?
Where did you go to elementary school?
We went to Kellum School. That was on, was that 22nd and Paul. That was the beginning. It was an integrated school. And I found that if you helped the black students there with their papers, you were their best friend. They'd give you candy, they'd give you whatever, and they didn't beat you up. And we were actually, I think, in the Lake School area, but because my two older brothers went to Kellum, that's where I wanted to go too. So I was allowed to go there.
Did you walk back and forth to school?
We walked back and forth, came home for lunch, and then I don't even remember how long a lunch hour we had, maybe 45 minutes. But we'd walk home, have a nice lunch, and then walk back. And it seemed there weren't as many snow days as we have now, It was below zero, you went to school. I remember one time when I was in kindergarten, and at that time I remember my mother saying that it was like 20 below an actual temperature. And she told me maybe I should stay home because I was only in kindergarten. It was too cold to go to school, and I started crying. I wanted to go to school. So they wrapped me up. They had this great big scarf that they had brought from Europe. And they wrapped me up in all my face, my everything. And my dad carried me all the way to Kellam School. And we got there, and I was crying because my hands got so cold. And the kindergarten teacher told me to put my hands over the heat register, and she kept warming them. And she said, you know, when it's so cold, you shouldn't come to school. And I said, well, I love school, and that, you know, this is why I wanted to be there. So, but I can still see just almost picture my dad, you know, carrying me. In winter times, he couldn't work because of the, you know, the produce and everything would freeze on the truck. So he would just be home. So those were really lean times. You kind of dreaded the winter. And of course, we had the house with the coal furnace. In the middle of the night, I'd hear my dad going downstairs, you know, put a few little more coals on the furnace to keep us warm. Didn't have an automatic water heater. You had to light your water heater to take a bath. So baths weren't too frequent. I think maybe Saturday night or maybe Sunday night you took a bath. And if you ran out of water, I remember my mother heating up the tea kettle on the stove to make maybe you have an inch of water in the bathtub, and you hurried and got out of there. Let's see, after elementary school, both my brothers went on to Central, so of course I followed the path. We went to Central High. My brothers graduated. See, my brother Dave graduated in 1947. My brother Lou graduated in 1945. And they both went on to Georgia Tech for college. Became aeronautical engineers, and then they moved on to Seattle. And I graduated high school in 1952. Then went to UNO for maybe 2 years and decided I'd had enough. I didn't want any more. So I left UNO and just went on working. Firstly at Brandeis, till I found something more permanent, because I had worked at Brandeis while I was going to high school and then UNO. So I worked there, and then eventually ended up at the Douglas County Abstract Company, where I did searching for real estate property at the courthouse to bring abstracts and things up to date. And then came, I met Joe's sister was my best friend. And I think Joe was in the service at the time, but his mother had his eye out for me. And she decided that I would be the perfect Jewish girl for her son to marry, but her son was in the service. So anytime she knew he was coming home on leave, she said, maybe you can come over this weekend. My Joe is coming home. And I think there's something wrong. They're trying to fix me up with this guy. He must be a jerk or something. So I would always be busy. And I said they still were going to make sure. So Joe came out of the service in 1955. And one of our friends had a party and invited both of us. And I looked at him and he looked at me and I thought, I don't like him. He's kind of a jerk. He's awfully quiet. And he thought I was kind of snobbish. So we just didn't hit it off. In fact, I was telling all of my friends, I don't know, Edie's brother is certainly a jerk. I don't know if I'd want to go out with him. Well, a couple weeks later, there was another party, and I thought, I'll give this guy a chance. And I went over and started talking to him and found that he wasn't really a jerk. He was just shy and needed a little prompting, and started talking to him, and I thought, this guy is okay. So I think we started dating in February of 55, and then we got married in May of 1956. And let's see, we had
Tell me about your wedding.
our wedding. Okay, our wedding was at Beth Israel Synagogue, I say on the 20th of May. And we had a pretty good size, for those days, pretty good size wedding party. Trying to think how many, Joe's sister, of course, Edie, her name now is Edith Commissar. She was my matron of honor because she was part of the reason Joe and I were together. And and her husband, Al Commissar, had gotten married just 3 weeks before we did. They got married at the end of April in 1956. So Edie was matron of honor, and then there was Carolyn Cutler, who then later became Ratner. She was a bridesmaid, and Anita Fellman was a bridesmaid. I'm trying to think who was in Joe's wedding party. Maury Schwartz was our best man. Ellie Ratner, Al Commissar, and who else was there? Oh, and Dave Bear was in the wedding party. We had a 7:00 wedding. Oh, my brother Lou was in the wedding. We had a 7:00 wedding. Then we had a reception, a dance. Took time for the Sheva Brochas. And then was it Ernie Priestman, I think, was the band at our wedding. Then we took off, we went to Colorado for our honeymoon. And I did a terrible thing on the way back from our honeymoon. It's a wonder we stayed married. 'Cause I was a smoker, and we were maybe outside of Lincoln. And we had the windows open in the car, and I was smoking a cigarette, and rather than put it out in the ashtray, I threw it out the window, and it flew in the back window of our car. We were coming back from Colorado, and all of a sudden we smelled something burning, and here our clothes some of them that we had like in plastic, covered with plastic bags, were burning. And the car seat, the back seat of the car was burning. So we stopped at a farmhouse or something in Lincoln, right outside of Lincoln, and pumped some water to put fire. And I don't think Joe spoke to me all the way back to Omaha. And that was the last time I think that no, I still smoked in the car. But I made sure that I always put the cigarette out in the ashtray. But isn't that a way to start a marriage?
Bev, tell me a little bit about a day in the life with your mom and dad.
It we were as poor could be, but I don't think I really realized it, because we had a lot of love, and it was always seemed like a happy atmosphere. I didn't know that, they were struggling to maybe pay a bill or anything, because everything was just, very happy. My mother was one that she'd be hanging clothes out on the clothesline, always singing, humming and singing these little Jewish songs. And if she wasn't singing, then we were worried because we didn't know what was wrong. Something had to be wrong if Mama wasn't singing. And my dad, oh my goodness, he'd get up probably 2, 3 in the morning to get ready to go down to the market to start loading up his truck, and probably work till 5, 6 o'clock. Come home on the summer days, the sweat was just pouring down his face. He'd come home and wash up real quick and still have that big smile on his face, and still had time like to take me for a walk, because I was the pampered little princess. Always take me for a walk. And if it had been a fairly good week, especially in the summer, they'd take us for ice cream to that Reed's Ice Cream that was on 20th Street. And if it was a good week, you got a nickel cone, but only once a week. But always, like I said, had time for us. My mother kept us just immaculate. I can't ever remember having like a dress or clothes bought from a store, but she'd always make sure. In fact, she would go, like, if she saw a dress like at Penny's downtown that she thought would look good on me, she'd just look at it and then go buy some material and try to duplicate the dress so I would still look stylish, which I give her a lot of credit for, because that was her concern, that I should look like everybody else. Always had a weight problem, but I think we were considered healthy. We had red cheeks and maybe 30 extra pounds. We were in good health. So I'd have this protruding stomach, but she'd always make sure to sew a dress so maybe you didn't accent your extra pounds. My dad, my mother and dad went to Kellam School, night school, to learn a little bit of English when they came here. I think my dad probably picked up a little more than my mom. So he was able to read just a little bit of the paper and everything, whereas my mother couldn't. But yet she would get the Yiddish paper, the Vorwärts they called it. And once a week she'd get the Americana. And so she was really up to date on all the news happenings because she could read it all in Jewish. I always, when I think back now, in order to catch a streetcar, she would recognize like the first letter of, I can't remember even what the streetcars, what their names were, but she would recognize, like, let's say if she had to go to Benson, she would recognize that the B meant that this would take her to Benson or someplace. So, they got around that way. Our parents told funny stories when they came here to the United States. They had never seen a banana in Europe. So when they saw a banana, they didn't know that you were supposed to peel them. And the first time they tried to eat a banana, they ate it, started eating it with the peeling and said it didn't taste good. And then whoever their relatives they were living with said that, in order for it to taste good, you had to take the skin off, the peeling. And, things, I guess, that we just don't even, we just take for granted, all these fruits and everything, which they didn't have access to in Europe or wherever they were. Trying to think, we always, like I said, had a good time there at home. In fact, Joe and I have often talked of the traditional meals that you always had as a child. And no, at our house, Tuesdays and Thursdays was always a milchika supper. Sunday, you had like your main meal was usually in the afternoon. Now, if we weren't going like to relatives or something on Sunday, then my mother would cook at home, and you'd always have hamburger conclaten. And they fried them with, first of all, you heated up all that schmaltz and the onion, and then you made the hamburgers probably with lots of filler so it would go further. Mashed potatoes with schmaltz. And sometimes they'd throw an egg into the mashed potatoes and schmaltz, so you had a little more cholesterol, a little more taste. And there were times too, I know, when things were really lean, my parents would give us like maybe the better food that was in the house, and they would open like maybe a can of sardines or whatever they called a tomato herring and eat that, where we were eating the better food. And they do it kind of on the sly, so we didn't know, that they were eating less than what we had, just to make sure, that they provided us with food.
Do you remember a typical holiday meal at home?
Oh yeah. I was always with the gefilte fish, and then you'd have like soup, and then you'd have chicken, roasted chicken with Helzel, which we dearly loved. And then, well, for usually Rosh Hashanah, we had the strudel and the honey cake and the mandel bread. And the gefilte fish, I remember them grinding the fish, and then we didn't have like a washer or dryer or anything, so I always think of even like a typical Friday, Erev Shabbos. Firstly, my mother would make sure she baked sugar cookies, and then we always had apple strudel in the summer. We'd have sugar cookies, apple strudel, then she'd get the soup going, and then put the the chicken soup was cooking and the roast was roasting. Then we had to scrub the kitchen floor. Then, for some reason, we always put newspapers over the freshly washed floor. Then everybody had to get cleaned up because it was getting ready. We had to get ready for Shabbos. And I often think, at the end of the day, she'd always say, "Oh, I'm so tired. I'm not even hungry." And I think, my goodness, you put in such a full day's work. I often tell my children I felt deprived because I never had a store-bought cookie. All we could get was like the sugar cookies, and sometimes if there was an abundance of poppy seeds probably left over from Purim, we'd have poppy seed cookies. And there too, sometimes in the summer when things were good, I'd go downtown with my mother and we'd stop at Kresge's downtown, and you could buy the cookies in the bulk, and I'd get like some ice cream cookies or something, or the wafers, and I think I was in heaven. And I think some of these kids are getting store-bought cookies and we couldn't have them, and I felt deprived. And you think, now what I wouldn't do to have one of those homemade sugar cookies or some strudel like we had. But I remember too, like, before Purim, to make even the Hamantash, and it was like I remember my dad would bring home, I think they must have gotten the poppy seeds and things on 24th Street somewhere from the locals there. I don't know who sold them. And then you ground. So I think that was my dad's job. He'd get out the grinder and help my mother to grind up the poppy seeds. And then I don't know what the procedure was after that. I think you added honey, but it was like a 2 or 3 day ordeal even to get ready for that. And then there were even the bar mitzvahs and everything. Our brother's bar mitzvahs were at the Litvische Shul on 19th and Burt, the Beth Hamidrash HaGadol. And it wasn't like we have now. I mean, after the bar mitzvah, you went downstairs, there was herring, kichel, a little schnapps, maybe honey cake, and strudel, and that was it. Everybody said Mazel Tov, and that was the end of the thing. I often think too of the holidays of Rosh Hashanah, where we'd be at that shul and the women were upstairs, and the men were downstairs. I remember my dad looking up, and putting his finger on his lips to telling us to be quiet because the women were all talking. And on Yom Kippur, before I know I was old enough where I had a fast, I remember my mother would pack like a little sack with some strudel and maybe a little piece of challah and butter, and we would take it clear downstairs in the shul and sit there and eat till it was time to go home. And then there was a little shul on 19th Street called the Minyan, or we called it the Minyan. So like on Yom Kippur, if we didn't feel like going back to the shul on 19th and Burt, then my mother and I would just go over to the Minyan so we could get home faster, and we could prepare, I could help her warm up things so everybody else could break the fast. And you wonder too, we used to have such huge meals when we'd break the fast. We remember my parents would start out with like coffee and honey cake, and then you brought out the soup and the fish and the chicken. I mean, it was a whole meal. Now let me tell you about my children. When Joe and I were first married, we had a 4-room house on Pinckney Street. We bought a house rather than rent an apartment, and I thought we were big time because we paid $9,600 for this house, a 4-room house at 6620 Pinckney Street. So, of course, our first child, Bruce, was born there when we lived in that house, November 11th, 1957. And Joe was certain that we had to have a son to carry on the Frank name, so we did the right thing. Bruce came along, and we thoroughly enjoyed him and thought, well, this is okay, we'll try for a second child. This time we had to have a little girl, and our dream came true. We had Shelley April 20th, 1960. They basically got along pretty well when they were little, and we stayed in that house till 1965, and it was time to separate them because we only had 2 bedrooms there, so we had to split them up. So we moved to our present location in 1965. Shelley was just 4 when we moved here, getting ready to go to school, and Bruce was already in 1st grade, so he was the hot shot. Moved out here to this house. They ended up, there wasn't a school built yet out in this area because we were like out in the sticks at that time. In fact, my mother kept saying, "Oy vey, you're going to move to 110th Street. You may as well move out to Seattle with your brothers. I won't see you anymore." And so our kids had to be bused to West Maple School, almost like a little farmhouse on 88th and Maple, till Thomas Edison School was built on 97th and Burdett, and they were bused there. And I, of course, got involved being like a room mother I would alternate years. One year I was room mother for Bruce, and then I would do it for Shelley, and then I think Joe and Art Stein started, what do you call it, Cub Scouts. So I was a den mother for Bruce with Lori Stein. And see, they went on at Edison, then went to Morton Junior High, both of them, and then they went on to Burke High. And after Burke, both went on to UNL. Bruce graduated, 1984 from dental school. Shelley graduated 1982 with a degree in elementary ed. What else? They were good kids. I think they grew up too fast, but didn't realize it at the time. I'd like to close by saying that my life has been blessed with my wonderful children and grandchildren. My grandchildren are Stephen, who is now 17, Kelly, who is 15 and a half, and Jessica, who is 13 and a half. Uh, you are better than any stocks and bonds that we could have, and I love you all. This is a picture of uh, your grandfather or my dad's parents, Beryl and Rachel Bernstein, and the two ladies would have been my two aunts, Fradel and Rivka. These are my parents, Sam and Sonia Bernstein, on their wedding day, December 20th, 1925.